welcome to The Kill File, your favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Brittany, and each week we will explore the dark corners of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and murder. Join me as we uncover secrets, investigate evidence, and dive into the chilling details of some of the most fascinating cases. Get ready for a journey into the dark unknown, because in The Kill File, nothing stays buried forever. Hey guys, welcome to episode 4 of The Kill File. Today we are going to be talking about the alphabet murders, also known as the double initial murders. Trigger warnings for today. This one is about children. It involves murder, rape, sexual assault. It mentions sodomy, but very briefly, and it also mentions suicide a few times. So we are going to jump right in. I had never heard this story, but when I was trying to find cases to research, this one popped up, and I found it interesting because it is unsolved. They are currently testing DNA on one of the victims' cases, so we may soon have an answer as to who committed these awful crimes. So keep your fingers crossed and an eye out for updates. Okay, so the series of murders occurred between 1971 and 1973 in Rochester, New York. So yeah, we are going way back. First thing I want to say about this case is that one of the main suspects of this case has been released after serving 30 years in prison. The suspect is a 76-year-old man that had been serving a sentence of up to 25 years for sexual assault of an 11-year-old girl. Gross. But then he was detained after his prison term because he was considered to be a danger to public. He is now living on a street in Rochester, New York. There's been a book written about the alphabet murders. He was named as a suspect in the book, and it was said that he maintained an extensive prison correspondence with one of the authors, which is kind of an interesting little tidbit. So here we go. The first victim was a 10-year-old little girl named Carmen Colon, and she was murdered in November of 1971. She was sent to a local pharmacy on the afternoon of her disappearance to pick up a prescription. After Carmen talked to the pharmacist, she was said to have stepped outside to wait for the prescription. Carmen was only a block and a half away from her home, but sadly, she never returned to the pharmacy or her house. Carmen was said to live with her grandparents, and her family called the police when Carmen didn't come back. The police then swept the neighborhood, but found no sign of Carmen. After 2 days, 2 teenagers were riding their bicycles, spotted a body along a road that was infrequently used in a town called Riga near the Chile border. Her body was found, trigger warning, strangled, sexually assaulted or raped, and with fingernail marks on her neck and much of her body. It was said that within a month of her death, the case turned cold, which is super unfortunate and sad for her family. There were billboards put up with a picture of Carmen, and the billboard was begging the public for any information about Carmen's death and offered a $6,000 reward. Her crime went unsolved. So sad. The second victim was an 11-year-old girl named Wanda Wakowitz. She was murdered in April of 1973. Wanda's younger sister, Rita, says she remembers the day well, saying, quote, "They took her the day before my birthday, and I turned 10 when they found her." Rita also stated that her sister Wanda was a red-headed, 65-pound tomboy and was a tiny bundle of energy. I love how she describes her sister. She recalled that her sister was more into joking and roughhousing with the neighborhood boys than playing with Barbies. Rita said that the upper apartment that they called home had lived their mother Joyce, Wanda, Rita, and their infant sister, Michelle. Their father had apparently died of a heart attack at some point. After school, Joyce had sent Wanda to the grocery store to buy food, where she purchased tuna, milk, cupcakes, and cat food. I know a lot of you are thinking, why did these parents send their children alone to different places or whatever? But you got to remember that back in the 70s, this was considered normal. It was a different time then. We know better now, and the world is a different place now, but back then, a lot of people did this. In fact, Wanda's sister Rita even mentioned the fact that they didn't know any better. So after buying her groceries with a total of $8.52, Wanda vanished. 1 day later, the police found the body of young Wanda at the bottom of a highway embankment in Webster. Her murder looked strikingly similar to Carmen's, in where they both had been sexually assaulted and they had both been strangled. There were reports rolling in with tips, including reports that a man was driving a brown car and pulled a red-haired girl into the car the day that Wanda disappeared. But it was not the same brown car that had been seen on I-490 in Carmen's case. As terror swept through the community of Rochester, the police were searching for suspects. The third victim was an 11-year-old girl named Michelle Menza. She died November 26, 1973, around 6 months after Wanda was found. Michelle was said to be a thicker little girl. They said quote-unquote chubby, but I didn't like that they used that, so I'm going to say thicker. Michelle disappeared after she had been walking home from the shopping center. It was said her uncle had seen her and offered her a ride home, but that she had declined, which is just a bummer. 2 days later, police had found Michelle's body in Macedon. Again, the reports came pouring in. Michelle's older brother said, quote, "It must have been shortly after he, the uncle, left that the guy picked her up. My uncle was kind of upset with himself for so many years because he didn't pick her up and go back to the house." Yeah, I can imagine that he would have all sorts of feelings after that, the guilt. But he obviously didn't know, and it's really sad that he has to carry that around. There was one woman who had reported she had seen a young girl who looked like Michelle. She was outside a fast food place, and there was another tip that came in that somebody had seen a girl who looked a lot like Michelle at a fast food place in a vehicle, and a man was carrying 2 bags walking towards the car. Michelle's autopsy did show that she had eaten a hamburger before her death. There was also a report of a man who had seen a car that was stopped on the side of the road. It had had a flat tire. When the man stopped to help with the flat tire, he spoke to the driver and he saw a little girl who looked like Michelle sitting in the car. Apparently, the man driving the car made it very clear that he was not interested in receiving help. The witness who had reported this incident described this suspect to police, and since both witnesses had given similar descriptions, they were able to come up with a sketch. It said that for weeks, police had to filter through thousands of phone calls about this case. The authorities also said that they picked up debris along the path that she would have likely walked home from the restaurant. They said the possible evidence had filled several truck beds. A Rochester police officer commented after Michelle's death, and he said, quote, "The man who killed Wanda Walkowicz is responsible for this murder. There's also a strong possibility that he's responsible for killing Carmen Colon." End quote. I was interested to see that he flat out said whoever did this, whoever had killed Wanda, was also the same person that had killed Michelle, but that there was just a strong possibility that they had also killed Carmen. It seems like there was some hesitation with pointing the finger at the same person for Carmen, which I found interesting. Sources said that because there was an alleged serial killer that deliberately was selecting these young girls based on their double initials in their name was so terrifying for the families in upstate New York. Many parents were keeping their kids inside and afraid to let them out, especially if their first and last name started with the same letter. This case had been a 50-year-long media fascination, and the fact that these poor girls may have been chosen because of their names was super interesting to media as well. There was DNA found on 2 of the victims, but it unfortunately was destroyed before modern genetic technology was around. I just do not understand this. Why do they destroy evidence? I understand that if they keep all of the evidence from all of the crimes or whatever, that it would just be way too much. I even understand that once a case is definitively solved, maybe there's a confession or maybe a person is executed. I understand destroying the evidence then, but when there is a case that's unsolved, why? We could have potentially solved these cases right now and given these girls' families some damn peace and justice, and it was just robbed from them. I hate that for them. I know in the beginning I said that there is DNA testing and they believe that some of the DNA on Wanda's case is going to be tested and hopefully identified, but it's just super sad that the rest was destroyed. It said that while the police investigated multiple suspects, it was to no avail. It was reported, though, that in place of turning up with the correct suspect who committed these crimes, instead they turned up multiple murderers and sexual assailants in the Rochester area during the process of this investigation, which is horrifying for the people that live up there. One suspect was named Kenneth Bianchi, He's a known serial killer. Apparently, he grew up in the Rochester area before he moved all the way to California, and then he went on to become known as the Hillside Strangler. He still remains a suspect, even though he has reportedly denied any connections to the Alphabet murders. So something that I read that I found interesting and wanted to share with you guys, I was reading an article from Psychology Today, and it was talking about how far we've come in the understanding of violent crimes since the 1970s. It said that sexual homicide offenders seem to usually prefer a, quote, more intimate and personal weapon. What they mean by that is sexual predators that murder usually prefer methods like strangulation, asphyxiation, and beating their victims. Oh, that's awful. It's like intimate and awful. It's so sad. Out of these different methods, it said that strangulation is usually the preferred choice. It explained that one theory as to why these sexually motivated offenders could be attracted to strangulation in particular is because of the level of vulnerability that the victims they choose have. One study found that these particular perpetrators were also more likely to have victims that were intoxicated during their death. The article went on to say that researchers may be able to distinguish between sadistic killers, who are usually driven by sadistic homicidal needs, organized, and often rigorously premeditated crimes. And to me, when I read this, I immediately thought of Dahmer. This description screams Dahmer to me. So on the other hand, there is angry, opportunistic sexual predators, which are people who are like individuals that could be categorized as hostile and ready to act if they find themselves in suitable context. So it said that these angry killers who are motivated sexually are usually driven by homicidal fantasies and often report that they end up committing murder after experiencing some sort of stressful life event. So this could be things like a breakup, the loss of a job, financial hardship, which to me is like, yeah, these are stressful events and they do suck, don't get me wrong. But these are things that we all have to go through at some point in life. And the rest of us don't sit here and plot to kill everyone or anyone because of our own personal hardships. I know that we all deal with things different, and we are all entitled to the process of whatever we need to get past these things, except murder and violence. You cannot deal with hardships with murder and violence. It doesn't help you, and it traumatizes everyone around the victim. So there was a third hypothesis that the article talked about, and it said that psychologically speaking, it was by far the most interesting. This one is probably going to be pretty controversial, but I find it interesting. So the third hypothesis is sexual sadism. Now, before I talk about this or share my thoughts, I need to throw out there that this next section does not reflect the thoughts or desires that the BDSM community has, nor am I saying that anyone who participates in the BDSM lifestyle is a homicidal maniac or even has homicidal thoughts. Not at all. There's a huge difference between BDSM and homicidal sadism or sexual assault or rape. The article talks about sexual sadism as it relates to homicide, not as sexual sadism being the reason to kill or anything like that. Does that make sense? Because I don't want any confusion on what is being said in this article, but I know that there's always people out there who are going to twist what other people say into bad things or call them out for things they didn't actually say. I personally am supportive of whatever floats other people's boats as long as it's consensual, period. With that being said, we can move on to the article. So, sadism involves getting sexually aroused and excited from inflicting pain and suffering upon others. Something that I wonder about because now we have the BDSM community. And for those of you who don't know, BDSM stands for bondage and discipline, dominance and submission, and sadism and masochism. Sadism, as we learned, is sexual pleasure or gratification from inflicting pain, suffering, or humiliation of others. So I wonder if people had a community like the BDSM community back in the day where they could engage in these activities with consent, which is the most important thing I'm told in the BDSM community, that there needs to be consent and willingness to participate, which makes sense. But I wonder if any of the people who were particularly motivated by sadism, if they had had an outlet like this, like being a part of the BDSM community back then, would they still have killed people to fulfill their fantasies? Or would they have gotten enough satisfaction from engaging in these types of activities? Or do you think it's more that they wanted to kill someone, but they fantasize about doing it in a way that also fulfills their sexually sadistic needs? The article went on to say that for sadistic sexual homicide offenders, strangulation may offer some kinds of means to exercise greater power, domination, and control over their victims, which makes sense. It's sad and unfortunate, but it makes sense. The article states that, quote, a 2020 study found that sadism was prevalent in approximately 25% of child-targeted sexual homicide offenders. In comparison to those who target adults, these sexual homicide offenders were more likely to use sexual domination, meaning bondage, threatening with a knife or gun, but less likely to use physical or psychological torture and humiliation as part of their crime, end quote. Now, this brings up another thought. Are these sickos picking children because of the domination aspect? Or do you think they're just pedophiles? Because, obviously they're pedophiles, but what I'm asking you is, would there have been a little bit less homicide when it comes to sadism if they had had a safe, consensual adult environment to play out their fantasies? Or, I don't know, maybe I'm just talking out of my ass. Maybe the BDSM community was already a thing back then, but it just wasn't talked about as much. What do I know? It's just sad to think, or maybe I'm just curious. I'm always trying to figure out why people do the things they do. What makes people tick? I'm always wondering. In 2009, there was an article that came out in the Democrat and Chronicle about this case, and it stated that the police had exhumed the corpse of one of the suspects, who was actually a firefighter, whose name was Dennis Termini, that was also a suspect of being a serial sexual assailant, to compare his DNA to what they had left from the crime scene, but we will talk about him more in a minute. The article went on to say for some of the investigators on this still open case, it has become a mission to solve it. I love to see that. It said that at this time, and hopefully it's still the same, but I'm not sure, it said that people who were investigating the case would meet with the retired former colleagues who were investigating these crimes back in the 70s to talk about their suspects, their theories, and any leads that still may need some attention. I like that. I like to think that there's still people out there that are fighting the good fight and fighting hard for these victims after all this time, and they're still trying to get justice for these families. Also, every time I research or learn about cases from the 60s and 80s, and even into the 90s, I am so glad that I didn't have kids back in these time periods. I have some serious anxiety about letting my children out of my sight already. I would like to think that I wouldn't have let them out of my sight back then, but I understand that it was a different time, and my heart just aches for these parents who lost their children during primetime killer or serial killer era. So it said there's a true crime writer named Michael Benson, who was the co-author of Nightmare in Rochester, The Double Initial Murders, and it said that this case has been sensationalized and that this man does not believe that all three murders are connected, which is interesting. He told Newsweek, quote, the crime scene for Wanda and Michelle are so similar that it's highly probable both of them were killed by the same man. The Carmen Colon case, however, was different in a number of ways. Her domestic situation was troubling. She was strangled in a different way and covered with fingernail scratches, end quote. Now, let's talk about suspects. I guess in Carmen's case, her uncle Miguel Colon was a chief suspect in her case in that he had unexpectedly left the United States and went to Puerto Rico just 2 days after her death, which is kind of suspicious, right? Why are you running if you didn't do anything wrong? So the former Monroe County Sheriff Detective Nicholas De Rosa traveled to Puerto Rico to try to find him, which was written about in the Democrat and Chronicle. In Miguel's car, authorities found a doll which was Carmen's, and it had also appeared that his car had been scrubbed clean, which is weird. It said in the newspaper, which has said to be reporting on this case extensively, that Miguel Colon later had returned to New York and he was questioned, but he was never charged with Carmen's murder. De Rosa told the newspaper, quote, I was disappointed that they never threw it to a grand jury to see if Miguel would be indicted. Apparently in 1991, Miguel Colon took his own life in his home in Rochester after a domestic dispute where he shot and wounded his wife and brother-in-law. When the police responded to a call about his house, he yelled at them to shoot him. Trigger warning. He then instead shot himself. A man named Robert Russello, who was now retired from the sheriff's office, was focusing on a different suspect, a man named James Barber. Apparently, this James guy also quickly left from the same area after Carmen's disappearance, and he had left many of his belongings in his apartment. James Barber worked in the Bullhead area, and it said that he actually penciled in his timestamp on his work card instead of having it punched in the automated system around the time of the crimes. What's more is that Robert Russello from the sheriff's office also said that Barber was already wanted for an assault and sodomy case on a 15-year-old girl in Ohio. Barber is now also deceased. There was another suspect in the ongoing investigation that had tried to rape a teenage girl in a garage, and police were able to intervene, and the man ran. This man's name was Dennis Termini, and he was a fireman in Rochester. The authorities said they chased him down the street and even over fences. As they closed in on Termini, trigger warning, he pulled out a handgun. It was a .45 caliber automatic pistol, and Termini put it to his head and shot himself. The police had determined he had actually already raped another teenager in the garage. It turns out this guy Dennis had actually been a serial rapist who was 25 years old, and he allegedly committed at least 14 rapes of teenage girls between 1971 and 1973. Both of the victims that were in his garage that day were not as young as the double initial murder victims, but there was other evidence to support him as being a suspect. His car matched the description of the cars that were seen in the abductions. He also kept a firefighter uniform in his car, and this was in tune of what the authorities already suspected, that the killer was probably a quote-unquote authority figure, which was why it was easy for him to lure the girls into his car without a fight. Benson, the writer, in case you forgot, believes that the victims having double initials was just a coincidence and do not have any relations to the killings, which is what I was kind of already wondering, because I understand that it's a hell of a coincidence, but I was thinking that if somebody was picking up these victims based on just their name, they would either have to drive up to little girls that were walking alone and ask them what their names were, and only grab the ones whose names started with the same letter for their first and last name, which to me, and this is just my opinion, but after these cases came out, wouldn't there have been a bunch of little girls reporting that some strange man was coming up to them and asking them their names and then driving off? Or, if it were true, then the other possibility in my brain was that the killer already knew all of these victims and chose them because of their names. It didn't make sense to me. That would lead me to think that maybe he was some kind of a teacher or something, but he would have to know all of them. Benson was also quoted saying, "There's no logical reason for double initials to be a factor in these cases. It's an interesting coincidence, but it's a tremendous leap to say that it's the reason why they were chosen for death." He went on to say, quote, "I believe the killer is a pedophile who is in a car looking for girls for a certain age, girls walking alone and unobserved. The abductions were opportunistic and had nothing to do with the victims and how they spelled their names." End quote. However, others believe that not only do the double initials have a meaning, but it was also noted as a weird tidbit that while their initials matched the first and last letter of their names, it also matched the area where the victim was found. There was Carmen near Chile, Wanda and Webster, and Michelle in the town of Macedon. Coincidence? No one can be sure. Benson also believed that the DNA is the best opportunity to find the killer of both Wanda and Michelle. Benson's co-author, named Donald Tubman, told Newsweek that the double initials are just an unhelpful coincidence and had added to the hysteria of the case. He too believed that Carmen's killer was not the same man who killed the other two girls. He said that several witnesses saw Carmen running. One source said naked, and one source said mostly naked from the waist down, on a highway after she was abducted, and that these circumstances were different. So let me get this straight. So there was people who saw her running naked down the highway and they didn't stop to help this poor girl. I mean, it said that they were going like 70 miles an hour and most of them didn't stop because they weren't sure what they just saw. But if I ever saw a young child running on the highway, naked or not naked, you could not stop me from pulling over to make sure that that kid was all right and see what's going on. That's not normal. It's so sad to think that this poor little girl most likely had already been sexually assaulted or raped and was able to somehow get away from the murderer and then ended up still murdered. Donald Tubman is actually a retired police officer who is now a private detective, and he believes that a Rochester man who had been jailed for over 30 years is most likely the person who killed Wanda and Michelle. He stated, quote, "He lived in the same neighborhood as Wanda and Michelle. They may have known him and may have saw him as an authority figure when he spoke to them. He went on to say that he, meaning the guy who was in prison but was now released, was free at the time of the murders. He was not incarcerated. He had a horrendous record. Michael Benson, the co-author, became his personal pen pal, and the suspect sent him all kinds of material, end quote. Tubman also stated that because DNA is being enhanced and better than it was before, he said that the familial DNA is also getting better. He said the suspects' families have been tracked down and found, and he believes that the police need to get a fresh sample of suspects' DNA and blood. I could not find this suspect's name anywhere, so if you're able to find it, let me know on social media who you find, because it didn't release a name. Tubman hopes that technology will help bring this long-awaited breakthrough that this case needs, which, yeah, I agree. I hope for the girls' families' sake that they are able to get to that. I hope that they are able to get some closure and some justice. I feel like they deserve it. The article where he was quoted saying these things to Newsweek was written in November of 2023, so it's actually not that long ago. It was also said that Wander's older sister has been campaigning for DNA evidence to be used in this unsolved murder, which, yeah, I think we would all like that. They're already doing that on cases, no? In March of 2022, there was a woman who posted on a social media site that she had numerous reasons to believe that her late grandfather may have been the alleged murderer in the Alphabet murders. It said that her grandfather was not the same man that was released from prison. In the beginning of her video, she started by saying, quote, "These are the reasons why I believe my grandfather may be the Rochester Alphabet killer." She went on to explain in the video that her aunt had been good friends with Wanda and that her grandfather had known her as well. She said that at the time, her grandfather owned a grocery store and had spoke to Wanda the day that she was last seen. She also said that he may have had a brown car like the killer allegedly had. In his grocery store, she went on to say that cats prowled for rats in the basement. This was important because it said that there was white cat hair found on all three victims, which I had not read until I read this article. However, Tubman had urged caution because he had said that he received many calls from numerous women who believed their father, their brother, their uncle, their grandfather were all responsible for the killings. I hope that they're taking these calls seriously because whoever did this, in my opinion, is probably going to be someone's father or brother or whatever, and they're out there. We just won't know until the DNA comes through, hopefully from Wanda's case, or unless someone else comes out with enough evidence to prove that it was their family member. And that, my friends, is where this story ends. Yeah, so it's still an open case. It's still unsolved. It's still a mystery. Who do you guys think did it? If you have any information, please contact the authorities. I'm sure Crime Stoppers probably still has this case as well. The whole time that I was reading this, I kept thinking, okay, Carmen's case could have been her uncle or whoever, and maybe after Wanda was found, it was a completely different person because it was so much later on. But then I wondered, what if it was not the same person who killed Michelle, but maybe just a copycat? Maybe not. They did mention the brown car in the case. I don't know. One report said that it was a brown hatchback. I really got stuck on how this person got the girls into their car in the first place. They said he must have lured them without a fight, but how do they know that's true? How do they know that he didn't just drive up and snatch him? Oh, something I forgot to mention before in Carmen's case was that where they saw her running naked or whatever down the highway, people also saw a car on the side of the highway backing up towards her. Is that not suspicious? You don't think it's weird that this young girl who was running naked and there was a weird car backing up trying to get her is suspicious? No one stopped. I can't wrap my head around that. That's awful. One report said that she was even waving her arms and trying to flag down cars, but I wasn't able to verify that, so who knows. I would like to think that if she was actively trying to wave down cars and waving her arms, that someone would have pulled over for her, but who knows. It's just so sad to think that she could have potentially gotten away. This whole case is just sad. Any murder is absolutely awful, but I think that we can all agree that children being raped in murder is just so much worse. It just makes me sick. I hope that they find this fucker. I'm going to post the picture from my research on the Kill Files socials. There's one police sketch from these witnesses, and it's such a 70s picture. He's got like the jean jacket or the jacket that's a popped up collar, the jeans and the boots on. You got to take a look at it and tell me your thoughts. And obviously, if anybody recognizes somebody, find an outlet to tell the FBI, the police, whoever's on this case, share that information, and let's get this guy caught. I hope that you guys have a great rest of your day, and I will see you next time. Bye! Well, that's it for today, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today and listening to another episode of The Kill File. If you want to share your thoughts on what we covered today, suggest a case for me to check out, or if you're just bored and looking for something to do, you can head over to The Kill File's social medias and reach out. We're on Facebook and Instagram as The Kill File, and we're on YouTube and TikTok as The Kill File Podcast. Also, feel free to check out our website at thekillfile.com, where you can learn more about me, your host, and a little bit more about how The Kill File got started. I love hearing from you guys. Come back on Mondays, wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, when we will cover another case on The Kill File, where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye!